Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session. We're just going to give it another minute to let a few more people come on the line, and then we'll get started. So I think we'll get started. Hello, and welcome everyone to today's webinar session entitled The Basics About Clinical Trials. My name is Kimberly Brunel, and I'm joined by my colleague Fiona Lewis, and we are patient educators at the AAMAC. If you don't know who we are, it's the Aplastic Anemia and Myelodysplasia Association of Canada, and we are a federally incorporated and registered national charity, and our goal is to provide seamless support to every Canadian patient, family member, friend, and concerned healthcare provider dealing with aplastic anemia, myelodysplasia, or PNH. If you'd like more information about our organization, please visit our website, aamac.ca, or Fiona are on the line, so you can ask us any questions throughout the presentation. Throughout the presentation, we are going to have everyone muted. Our speaker will cover her slides. At any time, I write any questions that you might have into the chat box or the question box. You should see it there on your screen. Feel free to write the questions throughout. We will be covering the questions at the end of the session only. So you can type anytime and we'll cover them towards the end. So without further ado, I will introduce our speaker for today. Dawn Richards is the founder of 502 Labs, Inc., and she's the Director of Patient and Public Engagement at Clinical Trials Ontario. She holds a PhD from the University of Alberta and has experience in a variety of roles during her past 15 years, but it's her diagnosis with rheumatoid arthritis 10 years ago that really instigated a journey to combine her passion for science with making the most of her diagnosis. In her role at CTO, Dawn is charged with executing on CTO's strategic pillar of patient and public education. So I'll pass it over to Dawn to begin the session.
Okay, thanks a lot. And good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here to talk to you today a little bit about clinical trials. And this is for anybody who's really interested in learning about clinical trials from the potential participant perspective. So today I'm going to talk about the organization I work for, which is called Clinical Trials Ontario. It's also abbreviated CTO. So if you hear me say CTO, that's what I'm talking about. I'm going to talk about basic information about clinical trials, again, from that potential participant's perspective. So some of the things you might like to know about if you're considering a clinical trial. And then I'm going to provide you with some information about finding a clinical trial. So some basic resources. CTO has a clinical trial finder, so I'll talk to you a little bit about that as well. And then we've got some time for questions at the end. So briefly, Clinical Trials Ontario's vision is to make Ontario a preferred place to do clinical trials. And we obviously want to do that while maintaining the highest ethical standards. And our mission is to strengthen, promote, and capitalize on Ontario's competitive advantages to conduct high-quality clinical trials. So really what that means is we're trying to make Ontario a great place to do high-quality clinical trials, and we are supported primarily by Ontario's Ministry of Colleges and Universities. So we have three strategic pillars, like was mentioned in my bio. The first pillar is to streamline. So as you can imagine, clinical trials can be complex, and they have a lot of different processes. And so a big part of what CTO has done is help streamline some of those processes so that things can start faster, they can be more efficient, and they can be more cost effective to doing studies. So I'll just give you an example. Before a clinical trial can be done, one of the steps is that it needs to be reviewed by what's called a research ethics board. And usually if there is a study that's happening at more than one location or more than one site, well, not usually, always, each site's research ethics board needs to review and approve the clinical trial protocol and all the associated paperwork with it. So something that CTO has done is streamlined that ethics review for clinical trials that happen at multiple sites across Ontario. And what that means is basically, instead of submitting packages to a number of research ethics boards, the clinical trial package can be submitted to one research ethics board. So if you had 5 sites doing a clinical trial, you would normally have to submit your paperwork to 5 different research ethics boards. In the case of Ontario, in many instances, that can be provided just to one research ethics board. So that's a really big deal for people who are doing clinical trials. And we're also working on some other things under the streamline pillar. The pillar that's engaged, that's where I work. And really what we're trying to do is to support and promote public and patient engagement with clinical trials. And we say with clinical trials, not in clinical trials, because one, we really want to just encourage the conversation like we're doing today about clinical trials as a potential option for people. And we also want to engage patients and the public as collaborators on research teams who are carrying out clinical trials. So we're engaging people not just to consider participation in clinical trials, but to also be parts of research teams who are doing clinical trials. Lastly, our strategic pillar promote is really our kind of outward facing pillar where we're promoting Ontario as a good place to do clinical trials. And what that does is that improves the overall quality of life and healthcare facilities for people who live in Ontario because cutting edge research is happening here that can be implemented sooner than it can be in other places. And quite frankly, clinical trials can provide a revenue stream for some organizations. And so that's important too. We have lots of great resources in Ontario, whether it's researchers, participants, our healthcare system, et cetera, that can do clinical trials at a really high quality. And part of our job is to promote that to the rest of the world. So everything that I'm going to talk to you today about is really under this engage pillar. So if you're interested, this is where our website is. It's www.ctontario.ca. And this is a screenshot of our homepage. Lots of the information here is for people who are doing clinical trials, so that might not be of much interest to you. But we do have a whole bunch of pages that are built for patients and the public. And we've got the drop-down menu showing here for you. And all of our patients and public web pages are available both in English and in French. So we work with a lot of national organizations, and it's important for those pages especially to be available in both official languages. And the information that I'm going to talk to you about today comes from our website, and it comes from a page under our patients and public website that is called Learn More About Clinical Trials. And I wanted to let you know too that everything on our website that's been built for patients and the public, we have built in collaboration with patients themselves, with health charities, and with patient organizations. So everything that you see in our patients and public web pages has been pressure tested, so to speak, by people who will be using it. And we think that that's made it a much better website. In our Learn More About Clinical Trials web pages, if you click on it, you'll see a number of these little chevrons or arrows. And underneath each of those, there's a heading. So I want to learn about clinical trials. I'm looking for a clinical trial. I found a clinical trial, and so on. And basically, you might pick up from there that each of those sections has been built depending on where you are in your kind of journey about considering a clinical trial. And so we've tried to kind of make the sections just pertain to that specific part in where you are thinking about a clinical trial. And so you'll click on each one of these and you'll see a number of frequently asked questions and responses for you. So that's how we built the website. And again, like I mentioned, the questions that are under each of those sections have also come to us from patients, health charities, and patient organizations. So I'm going to go through a little bit of the information that's on our website and just add a bit more color to it so that you can have an idea. And we're happy for you to visit the website at another time too. So what are clinical trials? I mean, that's the big thing that I have to help you out with today. And they are a type of research, so that's important. They are research, and they're a type of research that involves people, so involve humans. Clinical trials test what we call health-related interventions and outcomes. Intervention is kind of just a fancy word for treatment. And treatment doesn't always mean drug. We'll get into that in a little while, but keep your mind open about what treatments are. And clinical trials will often answer questions like, is the treatment safe? Does the treatment improve or cure disease? Or maybe does it help people live longer than other treatments that are currently available? Or maybe does the intervention or treatment help people feel better? So sometimes you'll hear quality of life. Does something improve quality of life? And that you can think about as feeling better also. So that's what clinical trials are to start off with. And I just made mention that clinical trials aren't always done just to study drugs. There's lots of other things that can be studied through clinical trials. And a treatment or an intervention might be studied on its own, or it might be studied in combination with other things. And here's a whole list of, in addition to drugs, what clinical trials might be used to study. So another thing is devices. So you can think of things like maybe a pacemaker or maybe an insulin pump. Those are examples of devices that have been tested through research. Might be a new type of surgery and comparing, for example, the outcomes of that surgery to a more established form of surgery. It might be a new way to do radiation therapy. Might be something to do with diagnostic procedures and even diet and lifestyle. So the intervention might be eating different types of foods, or it might be a certain exercise program. So again, I just wanted to mention that we often think of clinical trials being about drugs, but there are lots of other things that are also studied in clinical trials. So you might be asking yourself, well, why do we even do clinical trials, right? And that's an important question. There's a couple of good reasons here. And one is that they provide data about the treatment that's being tested, right? So they provide all kinds of evidence or data about the intervention that's being tested. And they also help people decide what new therapies or what other types of interventions might work best for people. So they help us make decisions about how we allocate healthcare and healthcare dollars and healthcare resources. And they'll often be compared to current standards of therapies and the ways that things are done now. And this kind of all helps move the needle forward in terms of how we allocate resources and how we treat people living with different conditions. So I am going to talk about how clinical trials are designed for drugs. It can be different for different types of interventions, but I think this is what a lot of people ask about, or maybe what you've heard about. So there's different phases to clinical trials, and things don't always go through all of the phases. It will often depend on the results or outcomes of the phase. And sometimes, depending on how the trial is going, the phase won't even finish. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that as I go through things here. So in phase 1, this is where studies are done in a small number of people. And this is also sometimes called the first in human stage. So this is the first time that the intervention is in people. And so this is an important phase around the safety of an intervention. And that's why there's a small number of individuals that it's done in here. In phase 2, if the intervention makes it to phase 2, so depending on the outcomes from phase 1, it may or may not make it to phase 2. And these are usually done in a larger number of people, usually between 100 and 300 people. And this is where the drug is looked at in terms of, does it do what it's supposed to do? So that's often called efficacy. Is it efficacious for the condition that's being studied? We'll look at dosing here, and we'll continue to look at safety. Oftentimes in phase 1 studies, these are people that don't live with any kind of health condition. They're often called healthy individuals in phase 1. So there we're just looking at how the drug is interacting when a person takes it. And I should also importantly say that often a drug has undergone many years of very basic preclinical studies before it gets to being put in people. So a lot of work I'll call it at the bench, and much work happens often in animals and in human cells before it goes into people. Phase 3 is when this is a much larger population now, in the thousands of individuals. And again, we're continuing to look at safety, and we're continuing to look at longer term side effects. And phase 4 is when the clinical trial happens in thousands of people. Sometimes this is also called the post-marketing surveillance study. And this is when a drug in this case has already been approved to be sold widely. And so it's outside of the more experimental stages of clinical trials, and it's being followed long-term in many people to look at the long-term ramifications of the treatment. So again, like I said, some drugs will go through all of these phases. Some will be stopped early at a phase and not move on, or it may be stopped early at a phase because it's working very well and it wouldn't be ethical to continue the study. So there's different reasons why phases might stop early, not always bad reasons. And the people in these studies are monitored very closely. And the experiments don't just start and then data is collected and looked at the end. The data that's coming in from the trial is monitored and watched closely, and decisions can be made along the way about things. You may have heard of randomized clinical trials. These are typically phase 3 clinical trials, and this is when there are 2 or more interventions or treatment arms, and they're compared to each other for the purposes of seeing how they work. And in those cases, they're called randomized because the participants in those studies are assigned by chance to one of the interventions. And this is to reduce the bias when looking at the data at the end of the study and during the study as well. So that's a bit of an overview for you about the different phases of clinical trials for drugs. And, you know, it's not my job to tell you that a clinical trial is what you're supposed to do. My job is to help you understand that you have different options that you might wish to consider. A clinical trial might be one of them. Another option might be that you don't receive any treatment. Another option might mean you're receiving a standard treatment or a different form of the treatment that you currently are on if you live with a disease or a condition. And option 3, you might choose to participate in a different research study if you're offered a clinical trial. Each one of these options will have different potential benefits and risks for you. And it would be a really good idea to talk to your doctor or healthcare provider to talk about what those potential known benefits and risks may be to help you make a decision that really works for you. We often get asked too, like, what if my healthcare provider offers me a clinical trial? Do I have to agree to be in this study? And the answer to that is no, you don't have to agree to be in the study if someone provides one to you. The reasons for that are your own personal reasons. If you feel it isn't the right choice for you, that's totally up to you. And your relationship with your healthcare provider shouldn't change no matter what you decide about the clinical trial. And people are just human, so there might be an effect there, but really that should not stop you from making the decision that you feel is right for you with respect to the study. There are different ways to find clinical trials. Some of you might have looked for a study yourselves, and so maybe some of these things will resonate with you. You could talk to your healthcare provider. We know that some providers have a better level of comfort and information about clinical trials than others, but that is one option. Another option is to ask a health charity or patient organization like AAMAC to see if they could help you find a trial. You might contact a hospital or an organization that does research. That might cause you to go through a bit more work to find a study than some of the other ways, or maybe not, depends who you end up talking to there, but that is another option. Sometimes you'll hear or read newspaper ads or see things on the TV or the radio. Oftentimes those tend to be phase 1 studies. Not always though, you can see other types of studies, and those could be things that you follow up on and explore, find more information out before you make your decision. And one of the things that I told you when we first started talking today was that Clinical Trials Ontario has developed what we call our Clinical Trial Finder. And I'm going to give you the web address for that, and I'll show you a little bit about that. And again, that might be another option for you to consider if you're interested in thinking about participating or finding a clinical trial. So this is the address of our trial finder. So you can link to it again from our website. It's under the patient and public subpages, and then it will be finding a clinical trial. And this is what the screen for it looks like. Again, this is another one of our resources where we developed it by having patients test it out and by having health charity and other patient organizations take a look at it and providing us with some feedback. So it's fairly simple and straightforward to use because we heard from people that can be an issue. It actually looks up results in a well-known database, which is www.clinicaltrials.gov. So that is hosted in the US by its National Institutes of Health. And so a lot of clinical trials are found there. However, if you go to their site, it can be fairly intimidating to search through, and there's a lot of different search features and functions you can use. So what we've done is we've just simplified what the search interface looks like, and we've also simplified and hopefully made the results a little bit easier to look at. So we heard from people that they're most interested in searching the condition that they live with, sometimes location, and I can tell you that to search our database, you can search by any province in Canada as well as all of Canada at the same time if you'd like, but you don't have to put in location. It will search Ontario by default. Study phase, again, you don't have to put in study phase. And demographics, again, you don't have to put in demographics. The bare minimum, you need to put in a condition to search and look for something. And yesterday I quickly did a search. So I just wanted to give you an example. This isn't to tell you to go look this up, but I wanted to give you an example that would apply to your community. And I also wanted to just show you what the subsequent pages look like in the Finder. So as I mentioned to you, at the very least, you have to type in a condition that you're interested in. And sometimes you have to play around with condition. So I tried a few different things here, and then I landed on myelodysplastic. And so I keyed that in. I didn't put anything under location, study phase, or demographics. So by default, it's going to search Ontario. And this is what the results came up as. And so this is typically what a results page comes up with. So up at the top, it tells you how many search results were found. And then on this page, it will list all 25 of them. I just took a screenshot of what I could fit on the screen though. So you can see it comes up with the name of the study. It reiterates the disease or condition. It will tell you the phase, and it will tell you, in this case, the centers in Ontario, if that information is available. And it will tell you if it's currently recruiting, and then it also gives you when the trial started, when the information was originally posted, and you can see that this information is about a year and a half or so old. And then the second study, you can see it also lists the disease conditions. This one's a phase 3 study. It's at a few more centers in Ontario. Apparently it's still recruiting, but you have to keep in mind that the info was last updated in 2018. So that's just to give you a snapshot of what the results look like. And this gives you then the chance to just scan through, in this case, the 25 studies, see what you're interested in, and then you can click on them to see further information about them. So in this case, I took the liberty of just clicking on the top one. And then this is what comes up. And it's a fairly clean page because what you need to do is click on each of these little arrows with the different subheadings, and then it will expand so that you'll see more information here. So in this case, the overview just has the disease and the phase, and then you could click on the other subheadings here, like the treatment and study arms, what it's actually measuring, where it is, additional information. And usually under additional information, there will be some contact information. And we've put on this website that if there's something you're interested in, you should follow up directly with the contact information that's there. At CTO, we wouldn't be able to help you with respect to specific studies. So that's just one example that I wanted to show you that might be applicable to your disease area. I just thought if I could show you there are some studies and you'd get a sense of what the results look like and what the interface looks like. And I was not brave enough to do a real-time demo online. I'm very afraid of technology, so I took screenshots here for you. So again, just an example for you. It's not intended in any way to say you should go look up the study. I just wanted to walk through the specific search interface and show you what some of the results look like from that. So we often get asked too, okay, there's a lot of information out there about clinical trials, and how do I decide if something's reputable or credible? Ultimately, that's your decision, but we can give you some kind of pointers on this. The first one is you should never be asked to pay an entrance fee to be part of a clinical trial. The study treatments should be covered by a reputable study, and there might be things like parking that are covered or maybe aren't covered. Your time generally is not covered to participate in a study. So there might be time for tests, there might be time for appointments, but you shouldn't be asked for like an entrance fee, and the study treatments and tests and things should mostly be covered, if not completely covered. You should look at the qualifications of the clinical trial team and be comfortable with that. Oftentimes, these are people who have expertise in a certain area. Sometimes they're affiliated with an academic center like a university, but you should look at those qualifications, like see who the principal investigator is, and you could do a little search on them. You can learn more about them. That's usually important. All clinical trials that run in Canada have to be, their applications have to be reviewed by a regulatory agency, so that would be Health Canada. It's usually not something that's advertised, but you could certainly ask for this information. And all clinical trials also have to be reviewed and approved by a research ethics board, and that should be something, again, that you can ask about and receive a response on. You could also ask if the clinical trial has been reviewed and approved by the institution or organization where it's taking place, because those institutions or organizations are responsible for what happens within their walls. So they will have reviewed and approved it. So those are some things to think about and to ask about too when you make your decision. And we also get asked, you know, what should I consider when I'm making a decision about a trial being right for me? And this is very personal. A number of these, in fact, the first 5 are the same as on the previous page about is it credible? So you have to be comfortable with the costs being covered. You need to be satisfied with the qualifications of the clinical trial team. You can certainly ask if the application has been reviewed by a regulatory agency and ensure that it's been reviewed and approved by an ethics board, as well as the institution or organization where it's taking place. Importantly, even if you want to participate in a clinical trial, you'll have to make sure that you meet certain eligibility criteria to be in a clinical trial. And that might be something like age. It might mean that you haven't taken a certain medication before, or you have taken a certain medication before. It might mean that you have to have some testing done beforehand. So important to know that even if you would like to be in a study, you'll have to meet these so-called eligibility criteria to be in the study itself. There's an important part of being in a clinical trial that's called informed consent. And a few key things about informed consent. Participating in a clinical trial is completely voluntary. So it's totally up to you whether or not you wish to participate. The second thing that's really important to know is that your consent may be withdrawn at any time. So at any time during the study, even though you've decided you want to be in the study, you can change your mind. And you know, that again is completely up to you. Maybe your life circumstances have changed, or you know, maybe you just no longer feel like you want to be part of the study. You don't have to give a reason for this. So this is completely up to you. And it's important to know that consent isn't a one-time thing. It's not just where you sign an informed consent at the start of the study, but it's ongoing. So it's really critical that as you continue to participate in the clinical trial, you are comfortable with what's going on, that you ask lots of questions, and make sure that you do, because that's really important. So if you decide that you no longer want to be in the study, that's called withdrawal, and you withdraw your consent, you can also ask that your data and any biological samples that you've provided be removed from the clinical trial as well. So not just you physically, but any of your data and any of the so-called biospecimens. So that might be blood, that might be urine, might be a tumor sample, whatever that biological material is, you can ask to have that removed. And continuing along this kind of topic, as I mentioned, leaving a clinical trial is called withdrawal. We've talked about the fact that you can end your participation at any time without needing to provide a reason. You might be asked for a reason. Again, you don't have to share that. You are encouraged to talk to the study doctor or the staff about your decision, or to ask questions before you make it. And that's just so that you can make the most informed decision that's right for you. That's not saying they're going to change your mind, but talk to them. And you may be asked questions about your experience, and you might have to also have some tests and physical exams, and that's so that you can safely stop the study. To make sure that it's safe for you to stop. And we already went over that you may be able to withdraw your permission to use information, so data and biological samples that have been collected about you too. Okay, some people ask us too, well, what if I can't find a clinical trial? So what can I do? Sometimes there might be a clinical trial that's not, that's in another location that you're interested in. So maybe not right close to you, maybe it's an hour or two away, or maybe it's even farther away than that. But one thing you can do is you can contact the study team, and you can ask if it's possible for you to participate in a study in another location. So if it is possible, you should also think about how this can affect you, right? So will there be significant travel time? Will you have to pay for your own travel to get there? Some studies will pay for your travel and sometimes hotel, etc. But those are all things that you should look into if you're interested in a clinical trial that's not close to you. In some cases, there may be ways to bring the clinical trial closer to you. You know, there might be an instance where there's a possibility of a site that could open at a medical center that's closer to you. Just being honest here, that might take a lot more work than some of the other options, but it is a possibility, and it's not unheard of for people to advocate for studies to be brought closer to them, to centers closer to them. And I also know lots of people who have simply kept up to date on the research, and they've watched, for example, some clinical trials open in centers that they're interested in, and over time, eventually that study has come to a place that's closer to them, that has allowed them to participate in the trial. Or in some disease areas, you know, there might be some studies in one location and then other studies open at other locations. So you might just choose to watch the research and check on it from time to time if something has become available closer to you. So I just wanted to reiterate that the information that I've shared with you here today is from our website, so www.ctontario.ca, and it's under the patients and public portion. Most of what we talked about was under the Learn More About Clinical Trials section here. And then we also talked about our clinical trial finder, and I showed you some example screenshots if that's something you're interested in using. So that's under the Find a Clinical Trial. And then we've got a few other things that may be helpful for you to see. So we've got what's called a Talk Clinical Trials campaign. So we've got some blogs and shared posts from people who have participated in studies or been collaborators on research studies and what that's meant to them. And we've got some other resources too, mostly for researchers around engaging patients as collaborators, and a bit about the groups that we work with, either patient groups or health charities and other organizations. So I just want to end. I know we've got lots of time for questions here, and I also wanted to make sure that you have my email available. I know some people don't like to ask questions here, so I'm more than happy to receive emails from you if you'd like to learn more about what I talked about today, or if you have any questions that you don't feel that you thought of after the webinar, or you don't feel were answered for you. So I'd really like to thank you for your time. I know I talked for a long time, and I'm also happy to go back to slides and talk about things that are on them if I glossed over them too quickly, but I'll open it up for questions at this point. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Dawn. We do have a few questions here. If those on the line still have questions, please feel free to start typing them in now. I'll just cover. So one of the questions here is, if I see a clinical trial on your website that I want to participate in, how would I go about registering for it?
Yeah, so what I'd suggest you do is, if you find a study that you're interested in most cases, there will be contact information in terms of who you can contact about asking questions about participation. So that's who you should follow up with. Is usually it says contact or more information is what the heading is, and you can just look at that information there. Sometimes there's an email address, sometimes there's a phone number, and you can follow up directly with whoever the contact is there. They'll be able to answer any of your questions for you, and they'll be able to help you out if you decide you'd like to follow up with pursuing the option of participation.
Okay, and then another question here is, does your website show clinical trials that are based outside of Ontario?
Yes, it does. You know what, I'm just going to go back a few slides and I'll show you where that would be. So like I said, I don't have this, so it's functioning, but under the location drop down here, you can select to search for a clinical trial in any province. So there will be a drop down that would allow you to select any province or territory. And one of the options is also Canada. So you could search all across the country or within any of the individual provinces and territories. That's a great question.
And so I'm going to assume, Dawn, that it would just be Canada-wide. There's nothing outside in the States or throughout the globe?
So that's how we've currently set up our clinical trial finders, just for Canada. If you did want to search for a study outside of Canada, I would suggest going to www.clinicaltrials.gov. And that's where we pull this information from. The interface looks a lot different from what this looks like, but there are instructions on how to use it, or I'd be happy to answer questions if I can help someone search it, or I could help you, Kim, so that you can be comfortable with helping people search it. That's not a problem.
Super, thanks. Okay, I see one. I think this might be the last one unless there's more coming in. Would it be suspicious if I'm receiving compensation for clinical trials? I think the question is, if someone's willing to pay me to be in a clinical trial, does that seem suspicious, or is that quite normal?
So that's another good question, and that's something I didn't talk about, but I'm going to go back in the slides again. So I'm going to go back to the phases of clinical trials. So I talked about the phase 1 studies often being called first in human. So this is the first time, in this case, drugs are given to people. And although there's been usually, as I mentioned, many years of work in the Petri dish and in animals. This is the first time it's in people. So you'll often see that it's been deemed acceptable to often pay phase 1 study participants compensation for taking the risk of being the first people that a drug goes into. So sometimes you'll hear on the radio that, you know, so much money is being provided to people to participate in a clinical trial, and it's usually a phase 1 study. You don't often see it in other studies. Again, this is where ethicists have determined that it's appropriate to pay people for the risk that they are taking in terms of being the first individuals that something has gone into. So this, sometimes you can hear it being in the thousands of dollars. In other studies, you'll often hear, I wouldn't call it compensation, I would call it having expenses reimbursed. So, you know, there will often be coverage provided for parking, sometimes for a meal if you have to be at a site for the entire day. But I call that being reimbursed for expenses, not being compensated. So it's not necessarily a flag to be compensated to participate in a study. It's more a question of what the phase is, and it's usually only phase 1 that you see that in, to be honest.
Okay, thank you. I don't see any more questions coming in. So I think we'll wrap up then. Thanks so much, Dawn. This is a great presentation. I know I learned a lot because I had lots of questions myself about clinical trials. If anyone has any questions moving forward, as Dawn mentioned, please feel free to reach out to her. Her email is there, or you can visit Clinical Trials Ontario to learn more. And if you're interested in learning more about AAMAC, again, you can visit us at aamac.ca. This webinar was recorded and will be posted on the AAMAC website in the near future. So if you want to go back to any part of that, you can listen to it on our website as well. And again, thanks very much, Dawn, and thank you to everyone, and hope you have a great day.
Okay, thanks a lot, everyone. Have a good day.
Bye-bye.
Bye.